My name is Jim Lalor. I'm a retired air traffic controller. This is the story of X-ray Alpha Fox Oscar uniform, a Mexican G2 that was on his way from Mexico to Munich. There were 4 pilots actually on board, and there were 4 passengers on board.
Executive Mexican jet that landed here in Mallow. On my right hand is Captain Ruben Ocana. And on his right, Captain Luis Flores, Captain Herman Valle, and on his left, Flight Engineer Jose Luis Rames.
A radar we used. The radar was primary surveillance radar. It had a range of 140 miles. It was very basic. It had concentric circles spreading out from the centre of the scope. The centre of the scope was actually Shannon Airport. So by reading the range you could read distance. There was a compass rose around the perimeter of the scope, and you could work out bearings. Mapping on the scope was very limited. The outline of the country and Shannon Estuary was on the scope, and the approach lines for runway 14, 32, 06 and 24. Also the control zones for Shannon and Cork were on it, and the prohibited airspace at Limerick was on it. That was about all you had as regards mapping. The radar we used in approach radar was the same radar, the range 140 miles, but we had reduced it down to 40 miles. To supplement that, we had the 1 in 500,000 aeronautical chart was taken. This was the chart that VFR pilots would use for navigational purposes. The other piece of equipment I'd like to talk about is RVR, Runway Visual Range. We had no automatic RVR. All we had was a system whereby we contacted a member of the fire crew and sent him out to the side of the runway, a pre-prepared site at the site of the runway. He counted the number of lights. That was relayed to the tower controller, who did a conversion, and then we had a reading in meters. The staffing that morning was Frank Wild was the tower controller, and he had an assistant controlling with her in the tower, Dave Cahill. Dave went on to become an Aer Lingus pilot. Mick Gloucester was the procedural controller in the area radar, in the area position, and he, alongside him, on his left was Dermot Collins, who was manning the radar scope. Liam Barry, who was a controller, seemed to be covering that position, but also manning the switchboard. I was the approach radar controller. Jim Rocket was the supervisor. Jim was a gent, senior man, would retire a few months later. The weather, before he came over to me, the Met report beginning to deteriorate, it listed an adjacent fog bank. So I had actually a look out the window, and there I saw this fog bank down towards the southeast, down towards Limerick, and it was about 200, if not 300 feet high, and it moving fairly quickly across the airfield up to the northwest. So I knew the fog was going to be an issue, and the tower controller was organising an RVR reading.
The RVR, which means runway visual range, more than 10 kilometers. But unfortunately, as soon as we start to descend and to be close of the airport, the runway visual range starts to close.
Also at the same time, the Aer Lingus 104 was on the way in from New York. The visibility began to drop, and Frank got an RVR reading, and it was around, I think it was 800 meters, and then it began to drop further. It dropped down to, I think it was 400 meters. At this stage, the Aer Lingus 104 decided he would hold, so he was cleared into the Ennis holding pattern at 4,000 feet. X-ray Alpha Fox Oscar uniform was slightly ahead, so he was going to be number 1 for the approach. So I vectored him, I steered him out for an ILS approach for runway 24. That meant I took him out to the northeast and gave him headings to fly to intercept the ILS at about 9 miles. He was now down at 2,100 feet. So the RVR at this stage had falling to 235 meters. So he reported established on the localizer and on the glide path, and I then cleared him for the approach and transferred him to the tower. Frank had a departure, an Aeroflot for Moscow, and he was planning to have the 2 arrivals in, and then he would have the departure out on runway 06, the reciprocal runway to 24. So the thing was then, the visibility was dropping further, and we eventually confirmed that he had done a go-around, and he initially was put out on a standard overshoot procedure.
And unfortunately, comes to 0. Let's say in the moment we were flying at the lowest altitude of the airport, 200 feet. So that was the reason we got not contact with the ground, and we have to execute a misapproach according with the landing plate of Shannon Airport. We climbed to 3,000 feet, and then we start to get contact with the proper frequency of the approach control, and they start to vectors and ask about intentions and about the alternate airport.
And then that was amended onto a heading of right turn onto a heading of 040 at 3,000 feet. In the meantime, Frank was lining up the Aeroflot for the departure of 06. The X-ray Alpha Fox Oscar uniform then inquired about the Dublin weather. His alternate was Dublin. It was 106 miles, and he had 2,000 pounds of fuel. So he just left it like that. Prior to this, I had a phone call from SRS, Shannon Repair Services, who informed me that his fuel situation, again, was tight. So I was aware that there was a situation developing that could have serious consequences for the safety of the aircraft and its passengers. So at this stage, the aircraft was transferred over to my frequency, and I turned him right onto a heading of 060. He's now going back out to the northeast for another approach. I passed him the Dublin weather. I then established that he had not the fuel to reach Dublin. In the meantime, the Aeroflot had taken off for Dublin. He's out of the way, and I turned X-ray Alpha Fox Oscar uniform onto a heading to come in for 180, heading 180 to come in for another ILS approach. At this stage, the RVR was 175 meters. He might fly another ILS approach, and he hopefully would land.
We start to talk between all this crew and analyze our shortage of fuel after the misapproach, because we use takeoff power. We drain a little more our tanks fuel tanks, and we start to analyze, and we conclude we have not successful fuel for to fly to Dublin. It was very close with the minimums to fly to Dublin. So that was one of the reasons we said we need a nearest airport of Shannon, and they suggest to us fly to Cork, only 50 miles south.
He couldn't fly to Dublin, so the alternate then was to go to Cork. It did cross my mind very early that, you know, what if he doesn't make Cork, right? So I was working on that at any spare moment I had. Initially, he was going to fly another ILS approach. Then he said he would go to Cork. Then he said, he asked me the distance again, and I said 55. And he replied, wow. But he decided to have another go. But sure, at that stage the RVR was 0, so it was pointless. So then he said, we'll go to Cork. I was conscious of the fuel burn off. If I climb him, I was conscious of the Galties. The Galties are 3018. If he's at 3,000 feet, right? Okay, I was happy enough that he was west of him. And I'm sort of hesitating. And next thing, Frank Wilde on the intercom shoots down 4,000 feet. Calls down 4,000 feet. So I had been hesitating because if I push him up higher, you know, you're pushing probably further into the cloud, and also there's the burn-off issue. But anyway, I went with Frank Wilde's suggestion. Right. I was still planning ahead, and I was saying, you know, if he doesn't make Cork, where is he going to come down? So I was looking at my chart, and I dismissed the road south of Mallow. I was familiar to an extent with the roads around Cork, and I knew, for the most part, I couldn't come up with a road section that might be suitable for a landing. I remember there was an awful lot of things flying through my head. You know, I was thinking of, don't bring them down on an area where there's likely to be an urban buildings, you know. Okay, but you want to bring them down if it was coming down someplace near an urban area. And I remember thinking about the Mallow Hospital. And I was looking at Mallow in particular. And then Echo India Alpha Whiskey Hotel came into my mind. Whiskey Hotel, when I was in Cork, there was a particular flight. They used to fly between Shannon and Mallow, a light aircraft, a Cessna 210. And it was quite a frequent service, but it used to land at Mallow. But there was no flight strip there as such, published. It was a private flight strip. So that crossed my mind. I started looking at Mallow, at the terrain around there, looking around Mallow. There I saw the racecourse with the river beside it, you know. So I had, that was a solution to a problem. You know, I had some place to bear in mind. The aircraft then was heading 180, 4,000 feet. He was still in cloud at that stage. And next thing he said, he had 1,000 pounds of fuel. And at this, then he said, we are in emergency.
We were flying in the area of Shannon, let's say taking headings according with the vectors and instructions of the controller on the way bound to Cork. And we got the advising lights, the warning lights of quantity fuel low. That lights means for us the actual quantity on our fuel tanks there is two. It has to be 700 pounds of fuel or less on each tank. So our total fuel 1400 or 1200. See. So with that warning lights and in that emergency situation, let's say, because Captain Flores was flying, he left from New York to Shannon, and he made a misapproach in Shannon. Because my position into the group, I said to Captain Flores, let me take your place, because this situation of coming short of fuel, I'm going to manage. So whatever I do comes, it's going to be
Your responsibility.
yes. So I start to flew from that moment on the way to Cork.
So at that stage, now I'm not aware if Jim Rocket was in the room, but I called for him to be summoned, But Jim came over anyway, and he suggested I take him to Farn 4. And I said, no, Jim. First of all, the weather. I didn't know what the weather was like down in Farn 4. I knew the weather in Cork was wide open because we had checked it before he actually set course for Mallow, for Cork. Also, the fact that the terrain I was going over, if I went direct to Farn 4, I'd be going over quite an extensive range of mountains, the Mullock Mountains. If I was going south, I was going over just a short section of the Ballyhoura Mountains. And, of course, Mallow was my roughly halfway point. Dermot Collins was in area radar, and he called me, and I looked over, and he said, Mallow Racecourse. And I nodded. So the decision was we were going for Cork, and if there was any further problems, Mallow was available. So then I asked him. He didn't tell me. I asked him, and he was hesitating about replying. I said, have you enough fuel to reach Cork? And I eventually established he hadn't enough fuel to reach Cork.
The controller asked to us, what is your status? And we answer, well, we are coming very short of fuel, and probably we have not sufficient for make a successful approach and landing at Cork Airport. And the controller mentioned the possibility that is with our criteria of use the race course in case you need to land in the next 2, 3, 4 minutes. You have that race course, probably it's good for that.
I had two fears. Now, two major fears, two major concerns. One of them was that the aircraft would come down in fog, right? Now, if he ran out of fuel and starts coming down, he won't drop like a stone. He'll glide. And I'd say the maximum distance he would glide would be about 8 to 10 miles, So if he wasn't within range of Mallow at that point, there was a problem. The only thing I could really do for him was to consider people on the ground. Don't let him come down in an urban environment, So that was, the other concern was, I had decided Mallow, but how do you get the aircraft to Mallow? That was the other. When I asked him, had he enough fuel, and he says no, the next thing I asked him was, had he the ground in sight? And he came back and he said he had the ground in sight. So I had great relief at that point, because now there was something. I can select Mallow on the map, bearing and distance, and transfer that to radar, And then I'm saying, how accurate is that going to be? I need this to be accurate, because the second fear I had was, supposing I vector him to the race course and he arrives and doesn't see it. What do I do then? You know, so that was my second fear. So what I decided, looking at the map again, you could see the river, the Blackwater, flowing from west to east. So it was a simple solution in the end. But then I told him Mallow was a town up ahead, and there was a racetrack a mile west of the town. And he said then, I see it. And is there smokes with it up? And I'm thinking, what's that? It's a factory. Is it the Mallow racetrack? And then I said, there is a large factory beside the racetrack on the south bank. Now, I didn't know that. And what had happened was, Dermot Collins had come over and he told me that that was the case. You know, that's where I got that piece of information from. Sure, just a minute or so later, he reported that this town was now due west of his position, and he was still 5 miles or more north of Mallow. So I suspect it was Charleville or maybe even Buttervant, right? So anyway, I started in there and I started saying to him, do you see the river? And he said, no. Do you see the railway track, which would be on his starboard side, his right-hand side? No, he didn't. So at this stage now, the pressure is really mounting, because it's coming to a sort of a climax, if you will, and I'm really feeling it, you know. So at 4 miles, I said to him, you have 4 miles to run to the river. And he said he didn't see it, and he didn't see Mallow. So I'm really scratching my head, and I've said, are you still in visual contact with the ground? And he said, yes. And then he followed up all of his media, we see the river. So I said, turn right, follow the river. So he did that. And then within a minute or so, he reported that he had the airfield in sight. And at this stage, Dermot went back to his position, because Mick Gloucester had been keeping the show on the road up to that point. So at this stage, I said, confirm you're going to make a landing, you're going to attempt a landing. And I'd also given him his distance to run to Cork. And he said he was going to make a landing, But he asked, the ground, is it soft? And then it dawned on me, I was using the word racetrack, meaning horse racetrack. Was he thinking a sort of a speed track, you know? So I said, it's a horse racetrack. The surface is grass. So at about this, I told him then that the civil authorities at Mallow had been informed about his imminent arrival, and that there was an aircraft just 20 miles away, area Mick and Dermot had vectored an aircraft over towards Mallow and transferred them on to my frequency.
I have in front of me my logbook that I had when I was a pilot with Avair back in 1983. And on the 18th of April, I can see an entry here flying from Dublin to Cork, where we made a diversion to Mallow Racecourse to assist an aircraft that was running out of fuel. Captain on that morning was Ian Faulkner. He was the handling pilot flying, and I was the monitoring pilot. So my responsibilities were to do the radio and keep a log of the flight. The aircraft itself, Shorts 330, had been built in Belfast. Registration here I see is Echo India Bravo Lima Papa. And it was a very basic kind of aircraft to fly. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have an autopilot. And we had been cruising at, I would imagine, about 7,000 or 8,000 feet, because we were unpressurized. And the controller explained that there was an aircraft flying from Shannon to Cork, and it was running out of fuel, and it was going to attempt a landing on Mallow Racecourse. And what the controller wanted us to do was to provide a relay on the radio as the aircraft descended onto the racecourse. So the controller then gave us a radar heading to fly towards the racetrack, and it probably was only about 5 minutes. It didn't take long, wasn't far out of our way. Not that we went fast on that airplane. Anyway, the controller, I could hear him talking to this other aircraft, and he was giving radar vectors to this aircraft. And when we started our diversion, I said to the controller, "What kind of aircraft are you talking about?" And I was expecting him to say a small Cessna or a Piper, light aircraft. And he came back and just said, "It's a G2. And I thought, my God, this is serious. So we carried on to Mallow Racecourse. And after a few minutes, I could see Mallow town, and we saw the track. And as we arrived at the track, I heard the pilot of the G2, or one of the pilots at least, call ATC and advise him that he could see the racetrack and they were going to land on it.
We found the race course, and I flew over to take a quick look of the race course, and I chose to land in westerly direction on the north side of the race course. In that seconds before our touch with the ground, I don't see any marks, anything. I just to try to keep the airfly over very close over the immediate obstacles. No?
Sure.
And as soon as I feel clear of that obstacles, I put the aircraft on the ground and using maximum reverse power, and because the surface too soft, we stopped the aircraft with that fortune in about 400 meters.
So Ian flew the aircraft over the track and then put the aircraft into a right-hand turn. And when I looked out the window, there was the G2 landing on the track. And it was a grass racetrack. So what I noticed most of all was that the grass appeared to be covered in frost or very heavy dew, and that the aircraft rolled to a stop very quickly, and that the area behind the aircraft, the grass looked as though all the dew or frost had been blown off or burnt off because it was a different color. The aircraft stopped quickly. It looked like the right wing had passed over one of the jumps from what I could see, but otherwise it looked as though there was no damage that I could see. So I called Shannon and I advised him that the aircraft appeared to have landed safely. Spoke to one of the pilots on the aircraft, and he told us everybody was safe. We continued to circle over the track for a few minutes, and we watched the passengers, I think there were 4 of them, get off the aircraft from the front air stairs on the left-hand side of the aircraft. And Ian made a public address to the passengers, not that we had many, and told them what was going on. And after a few minutes, we turned and we headed for Cork. And as we flew away, I remember seeing a Land Rover driving up the field, and I thought, this must be a manager or somebody from the racetrack turning up for work. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, that guy has a shock waiting for him.
How long was it before somebody actually came to you on the ground?
Well, I think about a couple of minutes.
A couple of minutes, and somebody got there too, yeah.
And also, I was very surprised noticing that the fire truck was running over the race course, a 2-hour airplane, very fast, and I didn't know
So
coming from.
the local fire brigade actually were out there,
yes,
which
and
speaks very well of the
very
local fire
well,
brigade.
very well.
Yes, that's
we
good.
assumed that probably Shannon approach controller advised him. But even though they didn't know exactly where are we going to land, so they saw we're playing, and pretty soon they started the trucks getting out of the place and running to the airport.
So it would seem that there was tremendous coordination and
Very
cooperation
good, very
between the controllers and
Very
everybody
sharp,
involved.
Yes, very precise.
Lost radar contact at this stage with the X-ray Alpha Fox Oscar uniform. There was about 5 minutes when we were waiting, and then the good news came in. But when the aircraft was landing on the racecourse, the local fire brigade, O'Connor said he could see him tearing down. It was brilliant. Like at this stage, like there was huge relief. And I have to say, like, it was a great piece of airmanship to put an aircraft down intact under those conditions, you know, running out of fuel. So that was it. About 10 minutes later, the weather improved and I vectored in the Shamrock, the Aer Lingus 104 for a landing. And that was it. I never gave any interviews with, I never even went to Mallow. I never met Captain O'Connor. He did come up to the control centre sometime later, but I wasn't there. And he's expressed his appreciation of the work done. Kevin Owens, he was the owner of the hotel in Mallow, the Hibernian Hotel, contacted me to say they were having a festival, and that Mexican family, the O'Connor family, were coming over for the event to spread his ashes, and he wanted me to go down. So I agreed to go down. I went down with my wife Nell and my youngest son, and it was a very pleasant occasion. But I always felt like I got huge publicity, but I often felt like the lads on the air traffic control is very much a team effort. The lads on the team, like Jim Rocket, Frank Wilde, Dave Cahill, Mick Gloucester, Dermot Collins, you know, they all played a role. And, you know, like Dermot Collins, when he came over and was behind me, like that was huge support. I wasn't on my own.
Shannon radar contact and flight heading right now.